or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 5th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Visions of America. In the 50 years since the bicentennial, the last major celebration of the nation's birth, our knowledge of the American Revolution has radically expanded. The Founding Fathers remain the central figures. But since the 1970s, historians have uncovered the fascinating, dramatic lives of many other players whose contributions were previously overlooked or lost in the archives. To mark the country's 250th anniversary, the New York Times Magazine asked 7 leading historians to each write about one of these everyday founders, a participant in the great drama of the nation's birth, whose story has rarely been told. Seen through these perspectives, the story looks different, and that's the point. To fully comprehend the American Revolution, we need both the towering few and the faceless many. Jane Kamensky, the president of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and an emerita historian at Harvard, writes in her introduction to the project, "All were ordinary and made themselves extraordinary. All took advantage of a moment of possibility, of rupture, to pursue happiness for themselves, their families, their people, and their country." The story starts in 1763, when Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War and became the dominant power in North America. The Treaty of Paris ceded nearly all French territory east of the Mississippi to the British Crown, but the victory created a new political rift. King George III sought to limit westward expansion into native territories to avoid expensive new frontier wars and protect the fur trade, while colonial farmers felt entitled to the soil that had just been won. Land, not taxes, was the first grievance that sparked conflict between Britain and its colonies, and one native leader knew that the fate of his people hung in the balance. In the winter of 1765, a man and his wife set out on a 275-mile journey by snowshoe. The man was an Oneida leader named Agualongdanguas, translated as breaking of the twigs. A pious Christian with a gentle manner and a gift for oratory, he was known to colonists as Good Peter. He was traveling to Connecticut to request that a missionary be sent to his village in central New York. Moving through settled territory was dangerous. Anti-native sentiment ran high among the colonists, but Peter carried an official pass to help ensure their safety. The farther east they traveled, the more evident it became that colonists had transformed the land. Farms had replaced forests, and the growth of the colonial population was driving demand for land to the west, native land. 2 years earlier, in 1763, King George III forbade settlement of native territory beyond the Appalachian Ridge. The settlers resented and sometimes defied this order. As Good Peter and his wife trekked through New England, they must have wondered how Britain could possibly keep its colonists contained. If the Oneida were to have a future on their land, he thought, they would have to find ways to coexist with the colonists. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Good Peter urged Oneida warriors to assist the Patriots as scouts, spies, and fighters. They became the colonists' most important native allies. At war's end, Good Peter sought to parlay the respect he had earned into securing Oneida ownership of their ancestral lands. Good Peter made a deal. The thousands of farmers pushing into native territories were driven in large part by economics. For colonial farmers, land was a path to economic security, but good farmland near the coast was expensive or unavailable. In parts of the North, much of it was owned by elites who hired tenant farmers to work their land and charged them high rents to do so. Elsewhere, yeoman farmers complained of unjust taxes and extortion by local officials. In the years leading up to the war, frustrated farmers in North Carolina and the Hudson Valley launched uprisings to defy corrupt officials and wealthy landlords. One of those early uprisings occurred in a place called Alamance. The Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775, the day British regulars killed 8 militiamen in Lexington, Massachusetts. But the first battle of the founding era took place 4 years earlier near Great Alamance Creek in North Carolina. On May 16, 1771, militiamen commanded by the colonial governor William Tryon faced off against about 2,000 farmers. The farmers called themselves regulators. For years, they had tried to rein in corruption by regulating lawyers and local officials who charged more for their services than the law allowed. They also objected to the grievous supplemental tax imposed on them to pay for Tryon's lavish new palace near the coast. The regulators had endured endless meetings, adopted countless resolutions. Some had beat up attorneys and court clerks. Now it was war. Tryon's soldiers had artillery and a clear command structure, while the regulators' democratic principles prevented them from even selecting a military leader. Tryon's army easily defeated the regulators, killing about 20 of them. After the battle, the governor hanged a captured regulator on the battlefield, but the man he wanted most wasn't there. Herman Husband had not fought in the Battle of Alamance. He was a pacifist, but Tryon wanted him anyway, dead or alive. With his fiery speeches and influential pamphlets, Husband had transformed his fellow farmers' complaints into a cause. Husband fled north, and Tryon's army laid waste to his farm and his home. Taking refuge in Pennsylvania in the early 1770s, Husband adopted a pseudonym, Tuscape Death, and resumed his battle against exploitation. Herman Husband's radical egalitarianism would make him a thorn in the side of the Founding Fathers. The end of the 7 Years' War not only set in motion a fight over Western land, it also left the British government with enormous debts. To pay them off, Parliament began imposing direct taxes on the colonies through legislation like the Stamp Act. Opposition to the Stamp Act and other royal policies led to intensifying conflict between colonists and the British, particularly in Massachusetts. To maintain control, Britain garrisoned soldiers in Boston. On March 5, 1770, some of these soldiers were guarding a customs house from an angry mob when shots were fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. Colonial papers quickly spread news of the slaughter, which became known as the Boston Massacre. The event solidified Massachusetts as the epicenter of the growing resistance, and one person who gave this movement a sense of noble purpose was an anonymous local playwright. The American Revolution was a war of the pen as much as a war of the sword. Soaring calls for action made the fight for independence possible. In 1772, before prominent works by people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, a play arrived that set the colonial imagination on fire. Called The Adulator, the play was published anonymously in a Massachusetts newspaper. In it, a shameless tyrant named Rapaccio plots to enslave the people of a free society. He was a thinly veiled version of the colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson, who had presided over tax policy, repressive laws, and the Boston Massacre. As his avatar, Rapaccio declares, "Despotic rule my sovereign wish." The adulator ripped through the young city of Boston. If colonists didn't read it in the paper themselves, they heard it spontaneously read aloud in their local taverns. It affirmed the colonists' growing outrage. Hutchinson and the British not only were limiting their rights but wanted to crush their liberty. Most readers would have thought that the work of history. Mercy Otis Warren was inspired to write by her opposition to tyranny grievance. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of without a license or disturbing the peace. Some avoided prison by signing legal documents promising not to evangelize in a particular county. Others spent months locked up, defiantly preaching to large gatherings through the bars of their cells. In response, jailers paid drummers to drown them out and burned hot peppers at prison doors to disperse the crowd. Eve of the Revolution, around half of all Baptist ministers had experienced imprisonment, often in brutal and degrading conditions. Independence would offer Leland a chance to challenge this oppression. John Leland took on the religious establishment in Virginia and in the new nation to come. There were glaring inconsistencies with the emerging credo of individual liberty professed by the Patriot movement. Most obviously was the issue of slavery. Black people made up 1/5 of the population of the colonies, and a vast majority of them were held in bondage. As Britain and its North American colonies began moving rapidly toward war, this free and enslaved black population wrestled with how to advance its own cause of equality. In June 1775, after the first battles at Lexington and Concord, George Washington, a Virginia slaveholder, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. Among the troops he commanded were several thousand black soldiers. Over the course of the war, a larger number of black soldiers, more than twice as many, would fight with the British, believing this to be a better path to liberation. Listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 5th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The black people who the Declaration of Independence announced to the world that the 13 American colonies were forming a new nation. 200 copies were printed in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. They were transported by horse and by foot to be read aloud in taverns and town squares throughout the colonies. For the Patriot troops, the Declaration served as a rallying call to continue the war in spite of harsh defeats. Lemuel Haynes, a free black soldier, probably first heard the Declaration read to his regiment. He was moved by its revolutionary rhetoric. The promise that all men are created equal held particular meaning for black soldiers, both free and enslaved. Perhaps all the talk about liberty and the criticism of tyranny suggested that a new day could dawn for everyone. This was a matter of faith, but faith was at the center of Haynes' life. He would become the first black minister ordained in the colonies. Haynes sat down to write a response to the Declaration. His essay, Liberty Further Extended, used Jefferson's words to denounce the practice of slavery. The essay, rediscovered in the 1980s, is the first known detailed analysis by a black person of the contradictions created by our founding document. Lemuel Haynes argued throughout his life that people of African descent had a place in the American experiment. Ideals alone don't win wars. Despite the Patriots' sense that they had embarked on a righteous crusade, the British soon anchored a fleet in New York Harbor. Washington's army was in near constant retreat through most of 1776. The Patriot victory at Trenton after Washington's midnight crossing of the Delaware brought a much-needed morale boost, but it didn't change the balance of war. The British had a professional fighting force and the most powerful navy in the world. The Patriots were a ragtop group of untrained recruits who enlisted for only months at a time, leaving Washington scrambling to lead an army that was regularly disbanding and reforming, plagued by chronic shortages of supplies, weapons, ammunition, and funds. As 1777 wore on, the British seemed unbeatable, and one Continental Army soldier was about to face his most harrowing battle yet. In late 1777, George Washington's army was on the brink of collapse. Ideals alone don't win wars. Despite the Patriots' sense that they had embarked on a righteous crusade, the British soon anchored a fleet in New York Harbor. Washington's army was in near constant retreat through most of 1776. The Patriot victory at Trenton after Washington's midnight crossing of the Delaware brought a much-needed morale boost, but it didn't change the balance of the war. The British had a professional fighting force and the most powerful navy in the world. The Patriots were a ragtop group of untrained recruits who enlisted for only months at a time, leaving Washington scrambling to lead an army that was regularly disbanding and reforming, plagued by chronic shortages of supplies, weapons, ammunition, and funds. As 1777 wore on, the British seemed unbeatable, and one Continental Army soldier was about to face his most harrowing battle yet. In 1777, George Washington's army was on the brink of collapse. It was the third year of a grinding war, and the British had just captured Philadelphia, the capital of the new American Republic. British warships then converged on Fort Mifflin, a key strategic position in Pennsylvania along the Delaware River. Every day, British cannon fire battered the fort's walls, and every night the soldiers would rush to rebuild them under cover of darkness. A 16-year-old soldier named Joseph Plum Martin wrote in his diary that he and his comrades were hungry, freezing, and suffering from disease. One day under fire, Martin was about to volunteer to climb a pole to post a signal flag, but another soldier went up instead. Martin watched as a soldier suffered a horrible fate. The man was split in half by a cannonball. After a week of incessant bombardment, the Patriots abandoned the fort. If ever destruction was complete, Martin wrote, "It was here." As Martin retreated, he caught a sobering final sight. His best friend lay among the dead. Martin's diary, the only published book-length memoir of a Continental Army soldier, was a revelation to historians when it was rediscovered in the 1950s. Joseph Plum Martin showed that the common soldier's endurance was critical to the Patriot victory. Over the next few years, an unlikely Patriot victory took shape. Washington's approach of strategic retreat wore down the Redcoats. The British surrender at Saratoga in 1777 persuaded the French to enter the war and provide troops, money, and ships to the Patriot cause, and the Patriot General Nathanael Greene ultimately prevailed in the South, where Loyalist and Patriot militias were fighting a brutal civil war. Americans across the colonies began to imagine their new country. How would it fare on its own? Who would be in charge? What would it look like to put into action the rhetoric about liberty that had empowered the movement for independence? Everyone had their own answers to these questions, and as the war drew to a close, they began trying to enact them. One such person was an enslaved woman living in a small town in Massachusetts. In August 1781, an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Freeman headed to a law office near her home in Sheffield, Massachusetts. She had an urgent question. The Revolutionary War was nearing its conclusion, and the roughly 700,000 enslaved people in the colonies were eager to test how far the Patriots' ideals might take them toward freedom. For decades, Freemen had been held as the property of John Ashley, a wealthy landowner and an officer in the local militia. In 1773, he hosted some of the town's most prominent men to write a manifesto called the Sheffield Declaration. Its call for liberty foreshadowed the Declaration of Independence. Freeman had very likely heard talk of natural rights in the Ashley home as she took coats and capes, served refreshments, and stoked the fire. On Sundays, in the Negro pew, churchgoers whispered about whether liberating their enslavers from tyranny might liberate them too. The law office Freeman sought that day belonged to Theodore Sedgwick, who had been among the men at Ashley's who wrote the Sheffield Declaration. Finding Sedgwick in, Freeman explained that she wanted to file suit against her owner to force him to emancipate her. She asked, "Won't the law give me my freedom?" Sedgwick agreed to take Freeman's case. It was time to test the reach of the Revolution's highest principles. Freeman was the first enslaved woman to use the new state constitution as the basis to sue for her freedom. Elizabeth Freeman's case would be a critical first step toward ending slavery in Massachusetts and in the country at large. The British surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia on October 19, 1781. Peace negotiations led in September 1783 to the Treaty of Paris, which formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. A world historic experiment had begun. For the first time in history, a large-scale republic would derive its authority solely from the consent of the governed. But an early dispute between the British and the Americans over the handling of formerly enslaved people demonstrated that the ideals of the Revolution were still limited in their application. Washington interpreted the Treaty of Paris as requiring the British to hand over enslaved people who had escaped behind British lines so they could be returned to what he saw as their rightful owners. Instead, the commander of the British forces evacuated thousands to Nova Scotia rather than return them to bondage. It was an early indication that, as Lemuel Haynes and Elizabeth Freeman had understood, much work remained to extend the promise of liberty, not only to enslaved people, but also to women, tenant farmers, and even the triumphant soldiers of the Continental Army. The 7 people in this project were all captivated by that promise, though it meant something different to each of them. Their stories and the many more brought to light by historians over the past 50 years remind us that actions large and small contribute to the movement of history, a useful reminder as we contemplate our own roles in the country's present. 250 years later, we stand at our own moment of rupture and possibility. Who else was a founder? Kamensky asks in her introduction. And dear reader, might you become one too? On language, how Goy went from Yiddish to anti-Semitic dog whistle to Zoomer slang. Oops, what's going on here? Goy, in Hebrew and Yiddish a non-Jewish person, today a confoundingly popular Gen Z slang term. Last week I interviewed a teenager about his use of the word goy slop. That's a term for cruddy low-quality food, as coined or at least popularized by far-right anti-Semites. This teenager was absolutely not a far-right anti-Semite. He just happened to attend a New Jersey high school where students, Jewish and Christian, and otherwise said goyslop all the time. If your friend goes and gets McDonald's and gets 2 burgers and a shake, he explained, like, oh my god, that's so goyslop. That's goy. If you enjoy Philip Roth, you might be interested to hear that this school sits not far from where Alexander Portnoy of Portnoy's Complaint was chastised by his mother for eating hamburgers and other chazarai junk while his constipated father drank not whiskey like a goy but mineral oil and milk of magnesia. That's one typical use of goy, or the plural goyim, to refer to those who aren't Jewish. The Hebrew goy just means a people. Bibles routinely translate it as nation, but it also came in Hebrew and Yiddish to describe the peoples that Jews lived among, say the ones Portnoy calls goyim with golden hair and silver tongues, the ones whose company will never actually promote his father, only treat him to the occasional weekend away in a fancy goyish hotel. All of this is really normal. The world is full of names for not us, Heol, Gayim, Englisher, Alaktun. They can be totally neutral or deeply unkind or just about anywhere in between. Many Jews would tell you goy is like, say, foreigner, neutral, but certainly capable of becoming an insult if the speaker wants it to. The abnormal part in this case begins with the distressing number of people who imagine that the world is controlled by secretive Jewish cabals and that the very existence of goy is airtight proof of their supremacist plot. For years now, anti-Semitic extremists have engaged in a trollish embrace of the word, creating, among other things, a neo-Nazi group called the Goyim Defense League and a fringe crowdfunding platform called Goy Fund Me. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service from July 5th. Some of these people felt vindicated by the release of documents concerning Jeffrey Epstein, never mind the exploitation of children. Here, in his inbox were wealthy Jewish men writing one another sardonic emails about the Goyim. The way Epstein used goy was often pretty similar to how Gentiles might joke about wasps, and his sourer uses just feel like a famously loathsome guy being loathsome, but still. Soon we had the far-right pundit Candace Owens creating this as proof of a bigotry fundamental to the faith. This is for them a religious philosophy, a racist perspective that we are goyim, meaning cattle, that are meant to be herded and ruled over, she told podcast listeners. That cattle idea traces back through literal Nazi propaganda to anti-Semitic sources like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If Owens really believes it to be true, she differs from other Catholics in her understanding of Scripture, which would have God promising Abraham that I will make of you a great cow. Goyslop has its roots in people who think this way, starting to agree with Portnoy's mother about the Chazarai, but they imagine sinister Jewish elites purposefully feeding the masses cheap, enfeebling swill, a notion they express for the most part not on podcasts but in flippant internet postings about the pliant goy cattle being herded to their troughs, and it's that version of goy that ended up leaching into high school. My source, 15, Jewish, a colleague's son, resident of a racially and religiously diverse suburb, estimates that at least 70% of the students in his school would be familiar with the goyslop. Another student who feels less firm on the exact meaning puts the number at just under half. He is fully aware that it arose via an anti-Semitic thing about Jews trying to kind of poison the minds of the people through food and stuff, but this is not, in his experience, remotely how it operates among his peers, who see it as criticizing, if anything, corporations. It's not really a thing like that anymore, he says, like everyone says it. This may be a wild journey for a word to take, but it's not an unusual one. The internet is full of fringe jargon that breaks containment and seeps, mostly shorn of its original politics, into the way ordinary young people talk. How, one analogy might be the way that, in conversation, you can use a silly voice to play act as another type of speaker, say pushing up your glasses and doing a nerd voice when correcting somebody. Online, people do this by parodying their posters' vocabulary or typing habits, including sometimes the language the fringes are constantly bombarding everyone else with. It gets toyed with at an amused and dismissive arm's length, then passes from arm's length to arm's length until it is miles from where it began, operating as a kind of 6-7-ish in-joke that many young people will tell you is not nearly as deep or serious as whatever alarming origins you're worried about. For them, it simply means something else. Does that make Goy an epic failure for anti-Semites who feared the eye-rolling of a few million Jews and now have even Gentiles using the word? There are times when a trip through the pipeline does seem to deflate extremist thinking. There are others when it feels as if incredibly unpleasant ideas are worming into the mainstream via glib, uninterrogated jokes. I cannot tell you which cases are which. Most everyone who says Goy slop is, on some level, kidding, but given the history of the ideas behind it, you might be forgiven for worrying that the joke had spun out of control. Screenland by Peter C. Baker. Why the papacy is a natural host for 6, 7, and other viral memes. Pope Cope. On the 6th day, the Bible says, God created all land animals and humankind. On the 7th day, God rested. And finally, just a few weeks ago, the Pope himself said 6-7. A group of Italian schoolchildren visiting the Vatican put him up to it when they showed Pope Leo XIV the hand gesture, a meaningless and wildly popular trend among Gen Z and Gen Alpha. He responded with befuddlement, but then he did his best to imitate it, and the kids went wild. The ensuing virality was, in retrospect, predictable. The Pope is experienced, dignified, stately. 6-7 is youthful, Dadaist nonsense, but that's not the whole story. 1 week later, another viral clip made clear that the pontiff was already getting more comfortable with his 6s and 7s. It shows him moving through the Italian city as Sarah in the Popemobile, waving to people gathered to witness his visit. Then, appearing to notice that he's being filmed, he looks right at the camera, arches his eyebrows meaningfully, as in, check this out, and does the thing. Again, Pope does meme, made international news. What a time to be alive. The world's largest Catholic news organization wrote in a caption on TikTok, but what makes Pope Leo memes so reliably sticky? Part of it comes down to memes' existential reliance on juxtaposition, high and low, solemn and goofy, TV shows and real life, or the papacy and brain rot humor. Memes work by smushing these contrasting elements together. Right, the meme asks. Right, we say back, when it's working anyway. The internet also memed Leo's predecessor, Francis, into distinctly contemporary situations. But Leo's normal guy from Chicago vibe has made memes in this mode irresistible since his election last year. Leo, da Pope, as Blues Brother on, of course, A Mission from God. Leo replacing Eucharist wafers with deep dish pizza. I could fill this entire column with more examples and still only be skimming the surface. In recent weeks, following not only his increasingly sentient 6/7s, but the publication of Magnificent Humanity, a church encyclical that called for AI to be disarmed. The trend expanded significantly. Soon there were posts about printing and the encyclical and gathering to read it with friends over margaritas, memes about lapsed Catholics or non believers feeling the atheism leaving my body, memes likening data center attacks to holy wars. They Then it seemed as if anything the Pope did that lightly grazed contemporary pop culture would go viral, like a video of Leo in the cockpit of a plane, which spawned screenshots of him smiling like a kid. We don't know what's in Leo's heart. Perhaps he's as clueless about his viral life as he first appeared to be about 6/7, but his every-awareness suggests that people online are viewing him through a new pop cultural lens, and I suspect this has something to do with Donald Trump. While all popes have taken stances on contemporary issues, only recently has this meant sparring with the President and Vice President of the United States, directly criticizing the administration on headline issues like the war in Iran and immigration, and being directly trashed in return by Trump on Truth Social. This has catapulted Leo to new prominence in the digital realm. For all of Trump's rising unpopularity, the internet remains shaped by his effect. He has long used memes to create a linked network of stories about himself. Awesome, beautiful, and his enemies deranged scum. Others, many others, in the political sphere have tried to use their own version of Trump's meme strategy. More have matched his nose for finding what works. Leo is a different kind of character in the internet landscape. He isn't a politician, not in any conventional sense of the word anyway, which means that he doesn't have to fight for attention. His constituents are built in, plus his visage comes preloaded with an old school meme technology. Catholicism itself, with its long tradition of image making and image contemplation as forms of devotion to God and godly existence. Memes that pit Leo against Trump often have an air of wish fulfillment that recalls cinematic epics like The Lord of the Rings and Dune, in which, in some decisive battle, a previously uncommitted but extremely powerful party steps off the sidelines and enters the fray, tipping the balance to vanquish the forces of darkness. AI is a source of existential anxiety and, like Trump, a pollutant of the global visual storybook where our collective mythos is formed. Part of why people latch on to clips of Leo 6/7ing is because they're heartwarmingly goofy. Since his visit to Acera, he has done the gesture on several more occasions, looking more delighted and knowing each time. But they also allow us to imagine that Leo knows what he's doing, that he's not just ready to fight, not just willing to pick up whatever tools will get the job done, but is also weirdly good at it. The Catholic Church's imagery, icons, crosses, churches, and their stained glass windows helps it to tell stories about Christianity and its place in the world. These images exist to be understood and enjoyed at a glance. Online jokes follow a similar logic. They don't just celebrate a certain way of looking at the world, but they invite the viewer into that celebration. Maybe you smile or chuckle. Maybe you repost. Maybe you start making your own. And while Pope memes are no proof that Trump or AI will lose, they do show how many people are eager to cheer a new challenger entering the ring. The Ethicist by Kwame Anthony Appiah. I'm worried my friend's son may harm them. Should I do something? I have friends in their 70s who have taken in their adult son following his divorce. It is going on 2 years now, and he is making no progress at finding work or moving out. Granted, he has mental health issues like panic disorder and depression, but he lives rent free, has a dog he does not take care of, and berates his parents on a regular basis. His parents won't even ask him to help around the house because they are afraid of his volatility. He can become extremely angry, especially toward his father. He also owns a gun. This last bit scares the heck out of me. His father is going to retire in a couple of months, and they are planning to sell their home and move out of state. They have told their son that he is not coming with them, and the son is upset about this. His mother is trying to put together family counseling sessions but is having difficulty finding something they can afford. As the deadline of the move approaches, I truly worry the son will shoot himself or shoot his parents and then himself. I've known this family for 35 years. Do I call Adult Protective Services? Do I alert the police that a mentally ill man owns a gun? I am truly concerned. It's often hard to judge from the outside whether people who own guns pose a threat to themselves or to others. You don't mention any facts about this person that indicate he is actually planning to harm himself or anyone else with this weapon. You don't say that his parents are worried about his misusing it either, and you don't suggest that he isn't legally entitled to have it. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 5th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. All the same, you're describing a disturbing situation, his volatility and abusive ways, the fact that his parents are so fearful of him that they haven't set ordinary household boundaries, the imminence of a major life upheaval that he isn't taking well, so you can legitimately share your concerns with the police, offering the details you know about. The message isn't a mentally ill man has a gun. You would be describing a specific pattern of volatility, abuse, intimidation, and distress about an upcoming rupture. More than 20 states have red flag laws that allow a judge to suspend someone's access to guns when there is a sufficient evidence that they pose a risk to themselves or to others. One thing the police are able to do is check whether the person has a permit for a weapon if you're in a jurisdiction that requires one. For all that, I wouldn't be surprised if there was nothing that law enforcement could do. That doesn't make you wrong to have made the call. And yes, I would also give serious thought to informing Adult Protective Services about your apprehensions. It isn't as if you would be disrupting an arrangement that's working for everyone involved. If his parents are being intimidated, they may need help planning a safe exit. Are you overestimating the dangers? Let's hope so, but given your concerns and given what you know, staying silent would be a decision too. This is a situation where it makes sense to ask for help. My husband's my husband's best friend is married to a woman who is an eternal victim, a compulsive liar, and a horrible gossip. She seems nice enough on the surface, but dig a few inches deep and you quickly realize why she has burned just about every bridge she has ever built. Her husband has accused mine of being distant, at times even hinting that he's a social climber for not wanting to go out with them and his wife. The resentment has been brewing for some time, and I am near my breaking point. My husband is a very nice man and a people pleaser, and I hate the fact that his friend has made him feel guilty. Do I encourage my husband to tell his friend the truth, or do we as two couples just continue to silently grow apart? I feel that my husband owes it to him as a friend to explain that his wife is someone we do not want in our lives. Right now it feels as if We're in this awful holding pattern, and I want to find a solution. Your husband, you suggest, is conflict averse in ways that would make it hard for him to talk to his friend about his wife. Yet you never actually say how your husband feels about her. That's worth pausing over. Is this a shared dislike that he feels unable to act on, or is it possible that he finds her company more tolerable than you do and has conflict aversion makes it hard for him to tell you so? But let's take up the ethical issue concerning the role of candor within relationships like these. If this woman is really as you describe her, her husband probably isn't totally unaware of her darker side. Still, what would be the result of the frank conversation that you evidently seek, even though you don't propose to initiate it yourself? Will the man vigorously agree and, energized by the revelation, start divorce proceedings? Or will he be loyal to his wife, as one would expect of a loving spouse, and respond by cutting off ties with your husband and you? I'm guessing he will choose loyalty, and I'm guessing you would be fine with that outcome. But what about your husband? He's the one with a close friendship at stake. Suppose your husband told his friend that he values his company, but that their wives don't get along, if that's the situation, or that the couple dynamic has become uncomfortable, if that's more the size of it, and he would rather see him one-on-one. If this isn't enough for his friend, your husband may have to accept that the friendship now comes with terms he can't honor. That's assuming, of course, that you're intent on bringing matters to a head. This woman might well be as difficult as you suggest, but before you urge your husband to speak on behalf of this we you invoke, make sure that we is truly the right pronoun. My brother has lived with our elderly mother in our childhood home for several years. At first his presence was helpful, but his support has declined and now appears largely financially dependent on her. Our mother is now in short-term inpatient rehab, and she wants to move to my city, closer to me and her grandchildren. She plans to enter assisted living here, which would require selling her home. I am conflicted about our obligations to my brother if the house is sold. He helped our mother in the past, but more recently he has hindered efforts to bring in professional caregivers and seems unwilling to continue as her caregiver. I do not want him left homeless, but he is an adult and has resisted previous offers of help. How should we handle his living situation as we move forward with our mother's relocation and the sale of her home? Your mother is the most vulnerable person in this picture, and her welfare is justly your priority. Dealing fairly with your brother means giving him notice so that he can prepare. You can help him look for housing, connect him with whatever services might be available, and discuss a defined amount of short-term assistance. But clarity is key. If it's your mother's decision to move closer to you and to sell the house, your brother needs to understand that he will have to make his own long-term living plans. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 5th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2 o'clock is episode number 8 of We the Women by Nora O'Donnell. Stay with us for these readings and more. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We broadcast daily readings of printed matter to those who are blind or have a print disability throughout Buffalo, Western New York, and Southern Ontario's Niagara Peninsula. Almost 40 years and more than 300,000 hours of radio readings to those without sight. Our broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNET. Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service broadcast studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga. Please let others know about your Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. For more information, call us at 716-821-5555.
Good day. From our studios